These are the notes for Goal 1.3, Recognize the Types and Purpose of Communication. The two things we're going to look at today are the fundamentals of communication and the levels of communication, so that you can understand the basic principles of how they all come together. Before we get too deep into the process, we need to understand the basic reasons for why we speak. And while it might seem like common sense, it's important to understand the distinction before we move forward. So really, the first reason that we speak is to exchange information. So you ask people how they're doing, you say hello, you talk to your teacher about a missing assignment. All of those are reasons for exchanging, or reasons for speaking by exchanging information. It's probably the most basic level of our communication and what we usually do the most. The second reason we speak is to influence the behavior of others. So anytime you want to convince somebody to do something, or you need to ask your parents permission to for something and you want them to agree with you, we are influencing the behavior of others. We see this a lot in leaders, politics, the media. The third reason we speak is to solve problems. So you will see large groups, small groups getting together to work to solve an issue, something that's going on. That is the third reason that we speak. Now, the reason for speaking is obviously based on the situation and the senders and receivers. And when you communicate, you don't even realize it, but you are aware of the purpose for your communication. You know when you're talking to someone if you want to influence their behavior, or you know if it's just to exchange friendly conversation and get some information. Now, this is the part in the process where communication can get a little confusing. It seems so simple. It seems like common sense. We do it without even thinking. But we have to stop and think about, why is communication tough sometimes? Why do we have a hard time saying what we need to? Why can't we get people to understand our side? And why do sometimes we get so caught up that we stop communicating and that we really never see eye to eye with people? And that has to do with the next slide that we're going to see. What do you see when you look at this picture? I want you to pause the presentation, look in your notes, and write down what you see. So just take a minute and write down what you see when you look at this image. Now, if there's someone around you that's in the same spot you are, talk about what you see. Do you see the same thing? Maybe you really don't see anything. You're not sure what you're supposed to be looking at. So find someone that you can talk with and figure out what you're supposed to be looking at and what the point of this is. So most people here see two things. They see an old lady and they see a young lady. Why, when people look at the same picture, the same image, do they see two different things? You may have recognized this last year, the big phenomenon with the blue dress, or was it a white dress, or yellow? I can't quite remember what colors it was. But people saw different things. So why do you think people look at something and see two different things? The answer to that question is what we call perspective. Perspective is how someone sees something. So the reason I can look at a picture and see the old lady and you could look at the picture and see the young lady is because we just see things the way we see them. Doesn't mean I'm wrong and you're right, it's just how we see it. Perspective is made up of our attitudes, our beliefs, and our values. So I was raised in a very conservative home. My mother had very strict values and things she believed, and for the most part, I adopted her values. If I was raised in a different home, I might have different political views. I might see things differently. So it's attitudes, beliefs, and values. Our perspective affects how I see oneself, or how we see ourselves, how we see others, and then also how others see you. We see this a lot when we talk about body image. We don't really see ourselves the way other people might look at us. So I might look in the mirror and think that I don't look very good, but somebody else sees me and their perspective of how I look is different. Now, the big issue with perspective is that when you don't consider what somebody else is already bringing to the conversation, that's where we have miscommunication. I recently saw a presentation where a 20-something girl was addressing a group of high school students. and she was talking about how they can promote their Facebook pages. Now, the ironic thing here is that teenagers aren't that into Facebook anymore. It's a different audience. So she did not consider her audience. She didn't consider the perspective that they have. So her view on Facebook and its benefits weren't the same as her audience's. So right away she lost her audience because she wasn't communicating and considering their perspective. You'll notice perspective playing a role in the classroom when a teacher might see a student with their arms crossed, or they'll look like they're falling asleep, and they'll call the student out, and the student will say, well, I wasn't falling asleep, but from the teacher's perspective, the student didn't look like they were paying attention. The student may have been, but it was the teacher's perspective that in that case was the most important. What we're going to do now is look at a couple scenarios and what can happen when the speaker does not consider the receiver's perspective. The first thing we're going to look at is a teacher, and she's getting ready to address students who won't do their homework. On your notes, take a couple seconds and jot down what could happen to the message if the teacher doesn't think about her students beforehand. Now let's look at a salesman selling a single mom a car. Again, same thing. What will happen, what could happen if the salesman tries to sell a single mom a car without recognizing her situation? And the last scenario, school counselors teaching seniors about financial aid. What do you think could happen to this message if the school counselors don't consider the students before they deliver their speech? Okay, so hopefully you have something written on your notes. Let's go back up to the top. A teacher addressing students who won't do homework. Some things that could happen if the teacher isn't thinking about why her students aren't doing homework is that she could be addressing a problem that really isn't there. She's assuming that the students are lazy, but maybe the reason they haven't done their homework is because they weren't sure what to do. So she's going to be yelling at them for something that, not yelling, teachers don't yell. She'll be talking to them about something that really isn't the issue, and then therefore her problem isn't going to be handled. A salesman selling a single mom a car. A couple things that could happen with that are he would try to sell her a car out of her price range. He might not stop to think about the fact that she is a single mom. He might just think that he is selling a woman a car, and therefore he's not going to really focus about what she needs. And you'll see this happen sometimes where school counselors will talk to seniors about financial aid. They might already assume certain things about the scenario. So they might already assume that some of those students are going to college when maybe a large part of their audience isn't going to college, and so they really don't care about financial aid. Other things that could happen with the bottom scenario is that the counselors maybe take for granted that the students already know a lot about financial aid. Some of them might already have it figured out, so they're not really going to be addressing the concerns of their audience. So by not considering perspective, our message can really not hit home. So before we address any sender or any receiver, we need to figure out what they already know on the subject and where they currently stand, and then our message will hit home a little bit better. Now that we've looked at the purpose of communication, why we do it, and how perspective can play a role in whether our communication is effective or not, we need to look at the fundamentals of communication in the 4 levels. There are 4 different levels of communication, so let's talk about those. Now, before we go any further, in your notes, I want you to take a guess about what you think each of these levels do or what they involve. So the levels are intrapersonal communication, interpersonal communication, person to group, and mass media. So in your notes, jot down what you think each of those could mean. So I'm sure you might have hit this on the head when you took a guess, but the first level is intrapersonal communication, and that's really communication within ourselves. Everyone likes to say, well, I don't talk to myself, that's weird, but we all do it. Intrapersonal communication is our thoughts and our words and images. So people will study why we think the way that we do. And without it, no other communication would be possible. So without your thoughts or organizing things on your own or thinking out loud, we wouldn't be able to communicate with other people. Some examples of intrapersonal communication would be when you try to figure out who you want to take to prom, or when you determine what you need to do that day and you make a list. Another example would be when you study for a test by yourself and you're going through the concepts in your notes, and that's all on your own. That is intrapersonal communication. The next level of communication is one that you probably do the most, the one that you are the most familiar with. It's the obvious form of communication, and that's interpersonal communication. Really, interpersonal communication is anytime you talk with somebody else. It could be with one person, it could be talking with all of your friends at your lunch table. It could be when you go home and you tell your parents about your day. Those are all forms of interpersonal communication. So underneath that, other types of interpersonal communication are dyadic, so that's two people. So in class, if I said form a dyad, you would find a partner. A small group. This is more than two people, but the possibility must exist for any and all people in the group to communicate. This might be a board meeting. This would be small groups in a class when you're working with 4 or 5 people. Example of a dyad or a small group would be talking at your lunch table, going on a date, group projects. All of those things you're fairly familiar with. Interpersonal communication. So the way that I remember the difference between intrapersonal communication and interpersonal communication is that prefix intra. It's a Latin prefix that actually means within. So that A, first letter of the alphabet, you could also think of it that way too, is one. Intra is communication within yourself. Inter as a prefix means between. So interpersonal communication is outside of yourself. So intra, one, within. Inter, outside, so that's you and somebody else. Another form of communication is what we call person to group. And this is what you're experiencing when you're in a speech class or when you're giving a speech, when you're in a class and the teacher is lecturing. Those are examples of person to group. So lectures, project reports, speeches. In this scenario, it's one sender or one message sent to many receivers. So one speaker, or it could be a couple speakers with the same message, but they're addressing an audience, usually 2 or more receivers. The last level of communication we're going to look at is mass media, and this one you're very familiar with. This is using technology to bring the same message to large groups of people. It's TV, radio, the internet, email. All of these are examples of mass media. Number of senders and receivers can vary. So you can have one sender to many receivers. This is an example of TV, newspaper, movies, where you're reaching hundreds or thousands or millions of people. Many to one is kind of the opposite. This would be many people sending a message to one person. For example, if people are upset about something that the president did, he is going to get thousands of emails. Protests are example of many to one. And the last one is a little more complicated and difficult to understand. You don't need to spend a lot of time worrying about it, but it's many to many. Blogs and social media are example of this. On one page, there are lots of messages being sent from many receivers, from many senders, to many receivers.